The Reformation was one of the great revolutions of European history. It changed the nature of the continent, it divided what had been a singular church, and it also provided new vocabularies for social, political, and economic change. What we've seen up to this point are challenges that tended to be much more local. The movement of the economic center, the movement of the force and power and authority of particular states or groups of states. We've seen economic and social changes manifesting themselves in various ways, but now what we see with the Reformation is in fact a cataclysmic change that affected the entire continent, because even those areas that remained Catholic had to redefine themselves and had to look at instruments by which they could protect themselves against this new revolution, against this new challenge coming from the Protestant sects. So Europe then enters a period that is particularly dangerous, particularly divisive, and particularly bloody. The coming of the Reformation also resulted in the coming of a period of religious wars that tore the continent apart for well over a century. Those who killed in the name of religion believed that they were doing so for God's justice. They believed truly that they had an answer to which there could be no compromise. And the consequence was a dangerous time in which the states of Europe fell into a series of conflicts that defined a century that was really known for shedding of blood. But nevertheless, at the same time, there were in this extremely dangerous time, there still were elements that provided the solution to the problem that war could never solve. New ideas, new concepts, new definitions, and a new vocabulary of social, political, and economic change that would ultimately supersede those of religion. And in this lecture, when we discuss the wars of religion, particularly in France, we will see how at the end of those wars, the only solution was to come up with a new kind of definition of what constituted the community. Not one that was driven only by ideas of religion and the concept of worshiping the same God, but rather ideas that related to things that could be changed easily by men on earth in the context of their political and social communities. So consequently, we can see coming out of the Reformation some new solutions and new ideas. But before we could get there, it was necessary to experience that terrible, terrible period known as the Wars of Religion. What we must remember is that the Reformation had resulted in the fragmenting of the Catholic Church. Entire provinces and millions of adherents had been lost, and so it was necessary to address the revolution that Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, and later Henry VIII of England and other reformers would then bring to bear against the once universal Roman confession. It was necessary then for the Roman confession to begin to fight back by adopting some of the very elements that had caused it so much danger, and that is the instruments that the reformers had invented in order to define themselves, not as Catholics, but as something else. Now Catholics had to redefine themselves. They had to reinforce their faith. They had to ask how many of the assaults of the Protestants really had validity, how many should be recognized, and how many should in fact be rejected out of hand. It was necessary then for the Church to reorganize itself in its own interests and also to ensure that that expansion of Europe into the New World would be the expansion of Catholic Europe, that Catholicism would have the energy and the commitment and the ability to ensure that the process of colonization and conversion would happen through Catholic means. The only way that this was possible was through a great council of the Church. We saw with the Council of Constance that ended the terrible period of the Great Schism, that only a council could deal with problems so complex and so wide, covering an entire continent, that those in the 16th century realized that it was necessary to recover this mechanism, to once again use a council in order to try and solve problems that seemed to be insoluble and that needed a universal and extraordinarily broad solution. In 1534, there was elected to the throne of St. Peter a Roman noble, a tough, very skilled and experienced cardinal, Paul III Farnese. Paul was determined that he was going to restructure the Roman Church, that he was going to address the assaults of the Protestants and try and at least stop their movement, if not, in fact, win back souls for the universal Roman confession. In 1542, he established the Roman Inquisition, for example. There had always been inquisitions. Every diocese had had an inquisition to determine what was heterodox and what was orthodox. But with the attack of the Protestants, it was necessary to ensure that there be a singular answer, that it was decided from Rome, from the center, what was to be accepted and what was to be identified as outside the Roman religion. So the Roman Inquisition then centralized the whole question of determining heterodoxy from orthodoxy. Moreover, this General Council had to deal with problems that were so complex, not just the assaults of the Protestants, but also problems within the church itself, a church that had been not only weakened, but whose resolve had also been undermined by the attack of the Protestants and the attack of those Christian humanists like Erasmus, that also questioned some of the principles in which the faith operated in some of the institutional structures that delivered that faith. And so it was necessary then to address these through a universal council that would define church doctrine and strengthen the faith. The Great Council met at the northern Italian city of Trent in 1545. However, the problems were so great and the factional battles so intense that the sessions lasted until 1563. 18 years with a number of hiatuses. 18 years of discussion in order to determine what constituted the fundamental principles of Catholicism. And the most important matters that were determined at Trent significantly represented the rejection of the very principles of the Protestant Reformation and the reaffirmation of those points of orthodoxy which those Protestants had attacked. It was necessary then for the church to know exactly what they believed and to be able to enforce and to teach those beliefs in a way that no more souls would be lost to the new religions. For example, the Latin Vulgate Bible was reaffirmed. In other words, the idea of a vernacular Bible that Luther had so promised with the translation of the Bible in the Wartburg. This was to be rejected, and St. Jerome, the doctor of the church who translated the Bible into Latin, was to be sustained, and it was to be sustained by those who could read that original Latin, which again strengthened the concept of a hierarchy of priests. Scholasticism, that is the application of Aristotelian logic to theological problems, that medieval instrument for determining and strengthening knowledge, was to be reaffirmed. And Thomas Aquinas, its greatest representative, was seen as the doctor of the church that in fact guided Catholic orthodoxy. So Erasmian biblical humanism was rejected. The idea of using humanist method in order to try and explicate the Bible in a way that humans could understand based on the experience of the time in which it was written and the experience of those reading was largely rejected. And the authority of the Pope was reaffirmed. It was maintained, and in fact it was strengthened, because it was necessary to have a single general in this war, someone who would be able to determine in this hierarchy of belief exactly what people should believe and how it should be, and how this belief should be strengthened. Similarly, the saints were recognized. The Protestants believed that the time of saints had passed. Well, the church said no, the church is a living instrument, and the traditions of the church were to become elements in the articles of faith. And so that meant that the witnessing of saints, those who were seen as models of Catholic behavior, they were to be continued because the church was a changing function, and the church was in fact not just bound by a single book of Revelation, but in fact how that book was interpreted depending on the time in which they lived. The seven sacraments were upheld, reaffirming the traditions of Catholicism against the Protestants that, of course, that reduced the number of sacraments, Luther to just 2. So the sacramental nature of Catholicism was powerfully reaffirmed. The Calvinist notion of predestination was specifically contradicted, and the endorsement of free will and good works reestablished. The idea then that we are all born saved or damned was something that the church completely rejected and said through our free will we will merit salvation or not. We play a role in our own salvation, and that is predicated on the idea of free will, which contradicts the very concept of predestination. Moreover, ritual, that practice of Catholicism that elegant life of the church, the beauty of the buildings themselves as the waiting rooms of heaven, and these needed to be elegant in order to qualify for that most sought after of addresses. The space that was to be seen as spiritually enriching because the spirit was being enriched through the senses. The idea of ritual then was powerfully reinforced as well, and artists and architects were called upon to decorate churches, to build them, to experiment with new forms of structures in order to raise the spirits and to encourage the senses to give rise to religious feeling. There were other elements as well that very specifically addressed some of the problems that the Lutherans had caused. For example, in 1559, there was established the Index of Prohibited Books. This index was a list of all of those titles that Catholics were not only not permitted to read, but possess. And the penalties for knowing their contents or possessing them were in fact serious. The reason was that the Pope realized that a central agency to allow people to know which books could lead them astray was required. The Protestant Reformation had succeeded and had spread so rapidly because of printing. The book had been shown to be the instrument by which the Reformation could move not only quickly, but also set down extremely deep roots, as the conventicles of Calvinists had indicated. So the only way that this could be addressed was to make sure that the faithful did not have access to these tainted ideas. And so the index grew larger every year. And in fact, the index was only abolished in 1966. Up until then, Catholics were given a list of books that they could and could not read. Besides those structural elements, and besides the great work of the Council of Trent and the definition and the reinforcing of Catholic practice and Catholic belief, it was necessary to establish different kinds of vehicles for the restoration of Catholic power and authority. Something that went beyond just the reaffirmation of the beliefs of traditional Catholicism based upon the traditions of the Church over the previous 1,500 years. There was also need of a new kind of religious order, one that was dynamic, one that could face the challenges of Protestantism directly. And that was founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuit order, or the Society of Jesus. Loyola was a Basque nobleman and soldier who grew up and fought in the crusading atmosphere of the Iberian Peninsula. He was a typical aristocratic soldier, not very well learned, tough, obedient, but in 1521, he had his leg almost blown off by a cannonball, and the long convalescence required indicated two things. First, that he would never be a soldier again, he was too badly injured, and that secondly, he was perhaps fighting for the wrong cause. Rather than fighting for his king, he should perhaps be fighting for Christ. He should in fact be a soldier for the Church to ensure that this new religion that is feeling that he feels with his own breast, this new enthusiasm, this new commitment to Catholicism, he could witness for and also use as an instrument to ensure that the Catholic Church would benefit from his abilities, his strength, and his will. He began reading devotional literature, and in fact, he made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and he enrolled at the University of Alcalá and later Paris. But it was during that period of his convalescence when he had a vision that lasted 9 days, and I don't think it was a result of the overdose of drugs, but it was a vision that gave him the shape of the book that he was to write, and the shape of an order that would take that book and then use it in an effective way in order to become soldiers for Christ and the Church. The book was the Spiritual Exercises, first printed in 1541, and the order that was to be founded was the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, in 1540. Loyola at Paris had picked up a number of disciples, and then they walked to Rome, and Paul III, although he was somewhat dubious about this curious man, allowed him to form this new order of the Jesuits. And with the spiritual exercises as their guide, and with the institutional structure of the Jesuits, which reported directly to the Pope as its institutionalization, St. Ignatius and the group were able to address what they saw as the fundamental problems facing Catholicism challenged by the Reformation. First of all, we have to note that Loyola's book, The Spiritual Exercises, isn't a book of devotion. It's not really a book of theology at all. It's a book of discipline. He was a soldier. It's a book of discipline that teaches the loyal Catholic how to submit one's will to the Church and then ultimately to Christ, with the Pope as the Vicar of Christ on earth. This book of discipline then was to ensure that the dangers of conversion by one of the new sects would be limited, and that the commitment to the Church would remain firm regardless of the context in which you should find yourself. The Jesuits then were able to take these ideas and to apply them to the three areas that they saw as the fundamental ones to address the problem of the Reformation: preaching, teaching, and missionary activities. And the fact that preaching was necessary was both to convert those in Europe who had already fallen to the Protestants and to reinforce the faith of those who were challenged by them, but also, of course, to ensure that those who were in Catholic countries could have a new image of the faith, that new faith that was clearly arising from a reinvigorated church that would find its voice in the Council of Trent. And also education. The schools the Jesuits founded were the best in Europe. They were the best because a humanist curriculum was applied to the structure of the faith. The Jesuits always said, "Give us a boy until he is 8 and he's ours forever." They taught disputation so that the Catholics could argue with the Protestants and win. They taught knowledge so that you could function in a rational environment but still be subject to the faith. It was an extremely sophisticated school system that was designed for and attracted the elite of Europe. The sons of the nobility, and in Catholic countries, the wealthy mercantile patrician, went to Jesuit schools. They were excellently educated, they were properly trained, and their faith was reinforced together with their reason. Moreover, the Jesuits wanted to expand this by not just teaching in the traditional environment of a school or a university, but also they wanted to make sure that the example of their life and their opportunity to interact with those who either were of heterodox belief or those whose faith may in fact be challenged could be best affected. So they lived among the people. They did not live in monasteries. They didn't separate themselves out. They usually didn't even wear clerical garb of any kind except for insignia to indicate to one another that they were members of the order. They were part of the community. And here you can see that the Catholics are beginning to define community not just as a community separated by function, with the laity and clergy totally separate, with one separated by the grace of ordination and the other part of a community through faith alone. What we see now is a blurring with the Jesuits and the structure that they put in place, not modeled on the Protestants, but still inspired by the idea that the concept of community, in fact, had changed. Missionary activity, of course, was critically important. And it was important not just to win souls back from the Protestants in Europe, but particularly to ensure that those in the newly discovered lands or those newly contacted in areas such as Africa and Asia would in fact be converted to Roman Christianity. So the Jesuits sent out missionaries with the conquistadors. The missionaries traveled with the voyagers, and especially to America. They went to French Canada. Francis Xavier went to Goa in India. They went to Africa. They went to the Far East. What they did then is that they went to those places where new converts could be found and where new Catholics could be made. In other words, they were looking then for the expansion of Catholicism to compensate to some extent for the losses of souls in the European continent itself. However, the spirit that brought about the Jesuits and the idea of soldiers for Christ, or the shock troops of the Church, also brought about a set of attitudes that gave rise to the religious wars of the 16th and 17th century. Wars so horrible that nothing like them had really been seen, at least on that scale, on the continent before. First of all, we have to remember that it was believed universally that it was the state's responsibility to enforce a single religion, that it was impossible to have more than one religion operating in any state because it was the glue that kept people together. And it's a world that functioned on trust. Could you actually accept the word or the oath of someone who did not share your religion? These were questions that essentially had never been addressed. Everybody assumed that this was in fact the necessary nature of things. The leader of Catholic Europe was Philip II of Spain, the son of the Emperor Charles V. Charles, before he died, abdicated and divided his vast empire between his brother Ferdinand, who received the empire and the Danube lands, and his son Philip, who was King of Spain and inherited much of Italy, the Low Countries, and of course the Indies. And Philip also inherited the zealous Catholicism of his father, committed totally and completely to be the defender of Catholic interests everywhere and to the expansion of Catholicism and also the winning of souls back for Catholicism from the Protestants. One of the areas where this conflict became concentrated and became almost the poster for the problem of the continent was the revolt of the Dutch states against the Spanish. Since the late 1560s, the Spanish had been engaged in really almost a war against Dutch rebels. The war wasn't a pitched battle in as much as two professional armies faced one another, but it was the Spanish who were seeking to establish firm control over the territories that they had inherited in the Low Countries in Northern Europe. The Dutch, though, saw the Spanish as oppressors, and it would ultimately lead a revolt that would not only humiliate Philip of Spain, but in fact would become one of the first popular, major, successful rebellions of a people against an unpopular foreign ruler. And religion, again, provided the vocabulary and the glue to allow this to happen. In a world before the definition of nationalism as we know it, and that commitment to space and commitment to a tradition that we can identify as keeping together a community today, religion fulfilled that function. Calvinism spread widely in the Netherlands, spread because it attracted the very group of people that dominated Dutch society, those wealthy, mercantile, urban patricians. Philip, though, refused to allow the practice of Protestantism in any form in any of his territories. So he introduced the Inquisition and the Jesuits to suppress it. The Calvinists responded by trying to humiliate the church. They flaunted the Inquisition. They went into Catholic Church and stripped altars, so that in 1565 it seemed as though the Catholics were going to be once more humiliated by the Protestants who simply refused to recognize the jurisdiction of the Roman Church as imposed by the Spanish and Philip. So by 1566, the violence that this led to between Protestant and Catholics and the danger to Catholic power in Europe prompted Philip to bring in a professional Spanish army led by a violent and brutal general, the Duke of Alva. That victory on the part of the Spaniards led to a repression and led to a violent reaction that saw the execution of the noble leaders and Calvinists hanged by the hundreds publicly in the street. But Philip didn't have his way. This didn't result in the pacification, but rather driving the revolt underground to what we would call today a guerrilla war. This was a popular revolt against the Spaniards. This was a revolt of a people who identified through religion against a violent and vicious foreign army of occupation led by a king that they had no respect for and whose religion they saw, in fact, as evil. This guerrilla war by 1576 had so enraged the Spanish army that it mutinied. They took out their anger on the city of Antwerp, and the Spanish fury, as it became known, saw again the slaughter of large numbers of Dutchmen. But this also galvanized the Calvinists to form a union, the Union of Utrecht, the United Provinces, together to fight the Spanish. In other words, identifying themselves as a people under oppression, willing to fight in order to achieve their independence from a force that they refused to recognize as just. The war lasted until 1609, when a 12-year truce was finally signed, and after the 30 Years' War, after that ultimately terrible war of religion in 1648, at the Treaty of Westphalia, the Dutch independent nation was recognized. Well, this was a victory then of a people against a foreign oppressor. One of the first popular revolts, and again, religion functioned as the glue that allowed this revolt to take place and provided part of the impetus and the ideology for revolt itself. But just as the Dutch state was coming together for these reasons of religious allegiance, this very same force was tearing apart the united, centralized Kingdom of France. Calvinism has spread quickly and widely through France. It was adopted by every class of citizen, but, as I noted, particularly the lesser nobility and the urban merchants. France was being broken up into two kingdoms, one Roman Catholic and one Calvinist or Huguenot. Both had their leaders. The Catholics were led by the House of Guise from the area of Lorraine. The Guise were the Catholic heroes. The Protestants were led by the House of Bourbon, led by the King of Navarre. The Calvinist faction and the Catholic faction were more or less equally balanced. This was manageable as long as the powerful, strong, intelligent King Henry II sat on the throne. But in 1559, he was killed accidentally in a tournament. A good example of why, if you're going to fight with pointed weapons, you should keep your visor down. He was fighting a joust with a Scots noble, Montgomery. The end of the lance became separated and entered his eye and his brain. The death of Henry II, while still young, resulted in his young sons inheriting the throne sequentially. And unable to control the forces of religion seething through the country, by 1562, civil war broke out. The real power behind the young boys sitting severally on the throne, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, was really the widow of Henry II. This was Catherine de' Medici. This was the Florentine who was seen as the Machiavel in Europe, a force so subtle that she tried to maintain the power of the crown by playing Protestant against Catholic. When the Protestants became too powerful, she supported the Catholics, and then vice versa, because she realized that both the Guise and the Bourbons had claims to the throne, and they had to be kept balanced, if not completely controlled, or her sons would never sit comfortably. The most horrible event took place in 1572 with the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. A wedding was to take place that was supposed to end the war. The leader of the Protestants, Henry, King of Navarre, Henry of Bourbon, was to be married to the sister of the King of France, Margaret of Valois. This wedding was to take place in Paris, and all of the great leaders of the Protestant families were invited. And while they were there preparing for the wedding, Catholics, soldiers came out of street corners and up staircases and slaughtered them by the thousands. The massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, the slaughter of 5,000 Protestant leaders in Paris and thousands throughout the rest of France, resulted in a renewal of civil war, made now much more difficult because of the atrocity of that event. But by the 1580s, the Guise overplayed their hand. They formed a Catholic league to ensure that the Protestant Henry of Bourbon would never inherit the throne. The league also allied with Spain to ensure that the Spanish, those zealous Catholics, would provide the support and the military power to keep Henry of Bourbon off the throne once it became clear that the House of Valois would become extinct. But the last ruler of the Valois house, Henry III, the very strange Henry III, feared the Guise more than he feared the Protestants, and he arranged for the assassination of the Duke of Guise and his brother, the Cardinal of Lorraine, ensuring then the succession of Henry of Navarre as King of France. This so angered the Catholics that a mad monk, Ravaillac, assassinated Henry III in 1589, and the Protestant Henry of Bourbon did become Henry IV of France. Henry then converted to Catholicism in order to unite the country, and also he fought a war with Spain to unite the nation against a common enemy. After the peace in 1598, He then engaged in an act of statesmanship so profound that it completely undid the idea that only one religion could function in one state. The Edict of Nantes of 1598 granted toleration to the Huguenots and made Calvinism legal. It meant that Calvinists could hold commissions in the army and high office in the civil service, and they were citizens equal in every way to Catholics. Rather than religious fanaticism, he saw the greatest raison d'etat, or reason of state, or great policy, to be that of national unity. In this, he was supported by a group of thinkers known as les politiques, those who defined the national good as superior to every other challenge, including those of religion. Henry IV then, le bon roi Henri, had created a new kind of state in his conversion, in the Edict of Nantes, and his bringing together of various forces who would then focus on the well-being of the Kingdom of France rather than their own confessional allegiances. This sadly led to his assassination in 1610, when another Catholic, having an opportunity when the king was caught in traffic, to kill him. The death of Henry, though, ended nothing, because the kingdom remained powerfully united and the concept of religion was secondary to the idea of the dynasty, the monarchy, the union of the state, and its well-being. Europe had entered a new phase, and this new phase was to be seen as an opportunity for change, to offer an alternative to the wars of religion and division, but nevertheless there were more wars to fight. There was the English Reformation and Civil War, and then the terrible 30 Years' War.